The document was only 9 pages long, but it ended 2 years of human hope in under 4 minutes. Counselor Braith read it aloud without expression, the way someone reads a weather report. His scales were pale gray under the assembly lights, and his voice carried the flat authority of someone who had made decisions like this before and expected to make them again. The hall was wide and cold and shaped like the inside of a shell, with curved walls that angled every sound toward the center. Every delegate heard every word perfectly. That was the design. Ambassador Foran sat at the human table near the outer ring. He had been in that chair for 11 months. He had learned which delegates made eye contact and which ones looked through him. He had learned that the Dravosi representative, Sith, always arrived exactly on time because arriving early suggested eagerness and arriving late suggested disrespect, and Sith regarded both as weaknesses. He had learned a great many things that would have been useful if the vote had gone differently. Braith finished reading. He set the document down. He asked if there were any procedural objections before the count. There were none. The voting took 40 seconds. 7 in favor of the provisional classification. 2 against. Humanity was not rejected. That was how Braith phrased it. They were classified as a developing signatory, a status that came with observer rights, limited communication access, and no protection under the Accord's mutual defense framework. Foran had read the framework. He knew what no protection meant in practical terms. It meant that if a Dravosi mining fleet decided a human colony's asteroid belt was more useful than the colony, the Accord would record the incident and move on. Foran thanked the council. He used the formal phrase correctly, in the correct dialect, and bowed at the correct angle. He had practiced all of it. In the corridor outside, his aide handed him a water pouch and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Foran drank half of it and looked at the curved ceiling, which was made from some kind of stone that wasn't stone, smooth and faintly blue. Braith's aide caught up with him near the exit corridor. The young one, Voru, moved quickly and kept his voice low. He said that the Dravosi report had not included the human propulsion refinements from the last decade. He said it in the tone of someone reporting a filing error, not an accusation. He said it, and then stopped, as if he wasn't sure why he had said it at all. Foran looked at him. Voru had large eyes, amber-colored, and he blinked slowly when he was uncertain. He was uncertain now. Foran said he appreciated that. Voru nodded once and went back the way he came. Foran watched him go, then sent a short message to Admiral Soren. He summarized the vote in 2 sentences. He said that the decision was final under current standing rules and that he saw no legal path to an immediate appeal. Soren's reply arrived in less than a minute. It said, "Send rail." Foran sent the message. Then he finished the rest of his water and went to file the formal record of the session, because someone had to, and it was always him. Back inside the chamber, the other delegates were already moving to the next item on the agenda, the Null Gate transit fees, an increase proposed by the Dravosi Collective. 6 species stood to be affected. It was, by any measure, a more pressing concern than the status of a species 200 years into space travel, with no fleet to speak of and no ancient ruins to their name. Braith reviewed the fee proposal. He was efficient. He did not waste time. Sith, from across the chamber, looked once toward the door through which Foran had left. He looked at it the way someone looks at a problem that has been correctly filed away. Then he turned back to the transit fee document and did not look at the door again. The thing was, Foran's message had not gone only to Soren. It had also gone to a secondary address, a relay node near the frontier outpost where a man named Rael Duran was in the middle of disassembling a power converter that wasn't his and wasn't broken. Rael fixed things that weren't broken as a way of understanding them. He had been doing it since he was 9 years old, and no one had ever fully convinced him it was a strange habit. He read the message once. He set down the converter housing. He looked at the outpost wall for a while, not at anything specific, just the wall. Then he started packing. He did not pack much. A change of clothes, his personal scanner, a small case of tools that would have looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were for. The scanner had been manufactured 12 years ago by a company that no longer existed, and Rael had modified it so many times that the only original part was the casing. It fit in one hand. He trusted it more than any instrument he had used in a certified lab, because he had built every layer of it himself, and he knew exactly where it would lie to him and why. He left the converter on the table, fully disassembled, with a handwritten note explaining what every component did. He did this for whoever came next, because someone always came next, and it cost him nothing to leave the door open. The shuttle to the relay point left in 2 hours. He was on it. Nobody told Rail he was not welcome. They didn't have to. The staging area outside the Null Gate had been converted into a working base over 6 years of failed repair attempts. The Dravosi team had brought 3 modular lab units, 2 scanning rigs the size of cargo containers, and 31 specialists whose credentials were displayed on a shared board near the entrance in the way that credentials are displayed when the people who have them want you to know they have them. The board was updated daily. It listed degrees, years of service, published papers. The smallest entry on it belonged to a Dravosi junior analyst who had only 4 publications to his name. Rail read the board once and did not look at it again. He set his travel case down near an unoccupied console and asked the nearest person where he could get the complete record of all previous repair attempts. The person, a Dravosi technician named Orville, stared at him for a moment, then pointed to a data terminal in the corner. Rail thanked him and went to it. He spent 6 hours there. He did not eat. He drank from a water flask he had brought himself because he hadn't found where the station kept its supply yet, and asking felt like a distraction. He read every report, all 47 proposals, all the skin data, all the logs. High Engineer Sith arrived on the 3rd day. His entrance was not dramatic. He simply walked in and the room shifted slightly, the way a room does when the person most people are afraid of comes through the door. Sith was tall for his species, with narrow shoulders and a very precise way of moving, as if he had decided in advance exactly how far each limb needed to travel. He noticed Rail immediately, the way a person notices something that does not belong. He walked over and looked at the travel case and then at Rail's scanner, which was sitting on the console next to a cup of cold water. He asked who Rail was. Rail told him. Sith asked what institute he was from. Rail named the Frontier Engineering Program, where he had done his last formal work 6 years ago. Sith clearly did not recognize it. He asked what Rail's primary discipline was. Rail said structural systems, then adaptive networks, then power routing, field resonance theory, materials stress analysis, low resource fabrication, and communication protocol design. He said it the same way he would read a list of items he needed from a supply room. Sith looked at him for a moment. Then he said that the Null Gate was not a frontier engineering problem. He said it politely, in the way that people are polite when they want the message to land cleanly. Rail agreed with him. He said the Null Gate was the most complex structure he had ever seen documentation on. Then he asked Sith why all 47 proposals had failed within 72 hours of implementation. Sith said that the gate's internal architecture was resistant to external intervention, that the founders had built it with self-correcting mechanisms that could not be overridden with current technology. Rail asked if that was a theory or if it had been directly observed. Sith said it was the conclusion supported by the evidence. Rail asked what the raw sensor logs showed at the moment each repair attempt failed. Not the interpreted data, the raw logs. Sith looked at him steadily and said that the raw logs had been reviewed. Rail asked if he could see them. There was a short pause. Then Sith instructed Orville to give the human access to the full sensor archive. He did it without breaking his expression, which was a particular kind of control that Rail recognized and respected even if he didn't particularly like it. Rail went back to the terminal. He stayed there all night. Around the 4th hour, he found something in the raw data that was not in any of the reports. It appeared in the logs of all 47 failed attempts, always within the final 30 seconds before collapse. A signal. Small, structured, regular. Not random interference. Not a system echo. It had a pattern. He stared at it for a long time. Then he put on his jacket, picked up his scanner, and walked to the gate's exterior access hatch. A Dravosi technician on watch duty told him the interior was off-limits due to structural instability. Rail asked who had issued that restriction. The technician said High Engineer Sith. Rail thanked him and went to find Sith. He knocked on the door of Sith's quarters at close to midnight by station time. Sith answered. He looked at Rail with the expression of someone who had been expecting something unpleasant and was mildly satisfied to find out exactly what it was. Rail said he needed to go inside the gate. Sith said that was not possible. Rail said that every repair done from outside had failed, and that there was a signal inside the gate that no one had identified, and that he would like to find out what it was. Sith said the risk was too high. Rail asked what the risk was of doing nothing. The gate was at 41% stability and dropping. He did the math out loud, plainly, without dramatizing it. At the current decay rate, they had weeks before the drop became irreversible. Sith said he would consider the request. Rail went back to the terminal and kept reading. In the morning, Sith sent him an access authorization with no comment attached. No explanation, just the authorization code. Rail put on a suit, checked his scanner twice, and went inside. The inside of the null gate was not what any of them had imagined, and none of them had imagined correctly. Rail knew this because he had read every description in the 47 reports, and every description mentioned structure, geometry, energy flow, field density. None of them mentioned that the interior felt inhabited. It was not a feeling in any soft sense. It was observable. The walls adjusted to his movement, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a corridor with airflow adjusts when a door is opened somewhere else. Except there was no airflow system inside the gate. The Dravosi scans had confirmed that. Whatever was adjusting was not mechanical in any way the reports had categorized. He moved slowly. His scanner was recording everything, and he watched the readings more than he watched where he was walking. The signal he had found in the raw logs was stronger in here. Much stronger. It was not random interference. Up close, it had a rhythm that reminded him of something he could not immediately name. He kept moving. The interior of the gate was vast. The access tunnels ran along the outer ring, narrow and dark except for Rail's suit light, but at the center there was an open chamber, spherical, roughly 40 meters across. He had not seen it in any of the scans because the Dravosi equipment had not been calibrated to look through the wall composition at that depth. In the center of the chamber was a node. That was the only word for it. A structure the size of a large desk, grown rather than built, made from the same material as the walls, but denser, darker. It was connected to the rest of the chamber by filaments so fine they were nearly invisible, and from it, steady and clear, came the signal. Rail sat down in front of it. He opened his case and started working. He did not have a translation protocol because no one had ever decoded the Founder's language. But Rail had once spent 8 months on an isolated colony where the entire computer network had degraded past the point of standard interface. The language was gone. The top layers were gone. What remained was the mathematical structure underneath, the logic that every communication system is built on, no matter who built it or when. He had learned to read that structure directly, the way someone learns to read emotion on a face they have never seen before by reading the shape of it rather than the words. He worked for 4 hours. His scanner fed him the signal in segments. He mapped the segments against base mathematical constants, the kind that do not change across species or centuries because they are not invented, they are found. Prime distributions, wave harmonics, recursive sequences. Slowly, a shape emerged. It was not a language. It was a state. The signal was not communicating information. It was communicating condition. And the condition it was communicating over and over, in every frequency it could reach, was something close to, I am still here. I am still working. Is anyone there? Rail sat with that for a while. Then he built a response node from the components in his case. It was not elegant. It was a collection of parts that had no business working together, attached to the gate's surface with adhesive strips he had brought, because he always brought adhesive strips. He programmed it to output the same mathematical base constants back at the signal source, in sequence, with a pause between each one. Not words. Just, I hear a pattern. Here is the same pattern back. I am listening. He sent it. For 12 minutes, nothing happened. Then the node in the center of the chamber brightened, very slightly, and the signal changed. It was still structured, but it was different now, directed, the way a voice changes when it stops calling out to an empty room and starts speaking to someone specific. Rail's scanner filled with data. He worked through the night translating it layer by layer, not words still, but intentions, states, requests. By morning he understood 3 things. The first was that the gate was not purely mechanical. It was a system designed to be tended, and at its center was an intelligence the founders had built to do the tending. Not alive in the way a person is alive, but aware, functional, purposeful. The Accord had been using the gate for 3 centuries and had never once spoken to it. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know it was there. The second was that every one of the 47 Dravosi repair attempts had been detected and reversed by this intelligence within 72 hours, not because the repairs were wrong in principle, but because they were applied without coordination. The intelligence was still doing its job. It was managing the gate alone. It had been doing so for 11,000 years. It was exhausted in whatever way a constructed mind can be exhausted, running on degraded resources, maintaining what it could, losing ground slowly. And every external intervention it did not understand, it had corrected, because correcting unknown changes was part of its function. The third thing Rail understood was that it had been sending that signal, that slow, patient, mathematical pulse, for a very long time. Not an alarm, not a distress call, something quieter than that. He wrote it out in plain language, because sometimes plain language is the only way to be sure you have understood something correctly. It had been asking if anyone was coming. He looked at what he had written. Then he looked at the node, still bright, still waiting. He sent back a response through the jury-rigged interface, the simplest thing he could construct, a signal that meant, yes, someone is here. The chamber was quiet. Then the signal steadied, and for the first time in 11,000 years, it stopped repeating. Rail came out of the gate carrying his scanner and his empty case and the expression of someone who has just read the last page of a book and is still deciding how to feel about it. Orville was the first one to see him. He took one look at Rail's face and went to get Sith. Sith came. The full Dravosi team assembled. Several of the other species engineers had heard that the human had spent an unauthorized night inside the gate and gathered out of curiosity or concern. Voru, who was technically present as an Accord observer, stood near the back of the group. Rail put his scanner on the table and walked them through what he had found. He did it without drama and without looking at the board with all the credentials on it. He explained the signal, the intelligence, the 11,000-year maintenance cycle, and the reason every repair attempt had been reversed. He showed them the raw data and the translated output. He showed them the response sequence. The room was quiet for a while after he finished. Then Sith said that the translation method was unverified. He said that constructing an interface with an unknown intelligence using improvised components was reckless. He said that the correct approach was to bring in proper equipment, run a full diagnostic of Rail's data, and design a sanctioned protocol before any further contact was attempted. 3 other engineers agreed with him. One of them said that even if the intelligence was real, it could not be trusted as a repair partner. Another said that the math Rail had used to establish contact was non-standard and could not be replicated without Rail present to interpret it, which made it scientifically unacceptable as a basis for action. They were not wrong about any of it. That was the frustrating part. Rail waited until they were done. Then he asked Sith to look at the stability reading on the gate's current output. It was at 34%. The decay had accelerated 3 points since Rail had gone inside, which was consistent with what the Warden, which was the name Rail had started using in his own notes for the gate's intelligence, had told him about the resources it was working with. The gate had weeks before a structural repair attempt would be possible at all. It had perhaps 2 weeks before the instability crossed the point of irreversibility. He said this plainly. He put the numbers on the display. He did not argue. Then he said that he needed 3 things. He read them from a list he had written on a piece of actual paper, which he used when he wanted to be sure he didn't forget anything. A stable power relay cable, a secondary interface unit, and 6 hours. Sif looked at the list. He looked at the gate's stability reading. He looked at his own team's modeling projections, which all showed the same slow collapse that Rail's numbers showed, and which none of them had produced a solution for. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he authorized the request. What happened over the next 6 hours was not clean or organized. Rail worked at the gate's external access with the interface he had started building the night before, extending it, stabilizing it, making it something that could carry a real conversation instead of just a mathematical handshake. He communicated with the Warden in a back and forth that his scanner translated imperfectly and often required him to rephrase 3 or 4 times before the meaning came through clearly. The Warden told him what it needed. Not repairs in the way the Dravosi had attempted repairs, external structures bolted onto a system they did not understand. It needed load redistribution. 2 of the gate's internal junction points were carrying more than they were designed for, because 3 others had degraded beyond function. If the 2 overloaded junctions could be reinforced, the Warden could rebalance the whole system. It had been trying to do this alone. It could not manage it alone anymore. Rail looked at the junction specifications and built a reinforcement structure out of what he had. It was, by Sith's later description, structurally absurd. It used materials that were not rated for the application. It was attached in a configuration that did not follow any published engineering standard. Sith said this to Voru in a low voice while watching Rail work, and Voru asked if it was going to fail. Sith watched for another moment, and then admitted he did not know. A message came from Admiral Soren. A human supply shuttle had arrived at the station. Soren had sent it 3 days ago, before Rail had even gone inside the gate. Loaded with materials Rail had flagged in a side note of an early message as potentially relevant. Captain Dale was flying it. She docked without announcement and sent Rail a single line asking where she should put things. The relay cable in the shuttle's cargo was exactly what Rail needed for the final junction. He hadn't asked for it specifically. He had mentioned the cable type offhand. Soren had read it and sent it. Rail used it. He finished the interface. He told the warden it was ready. The warden began the rebalance. Rail watched the stability reading. For 11 minutes it held at 34%, and his expression showed nothing. Then it moved. Slowly, steadily, point by point. 38, 43, 51, 67. It stopped at 91% and held. The room was very quiet. Voru was the one who spoke first. He asked Rail what the warden had said when the process completed. Rail looked at his scanner, where the final translated output was still on the screen. He read it aloud without adding anything to it. The warden had said, "Maintenance cycle resumed. Thank you for returning." The review session was not called by humanity. It was called by the Accord, which had a rule that any emergency event affecting shared infrastructure required a formal record within 30 days. Braith chaired it, the same way he chaired everything, with the particular steadiness of someone who had learned that staying calm in difficult rooms was its own kind of power. The record was not in dispute. The Dravosi Collective had worked the problem for 6 years with 31 specialists and produced 47 proposals. Every proposal had failed. A human engineer had worked the problem for 11 days and succeeded. The gate was stable. The warden was active. The maintenance cycle, which had been running on deteriorating reserves for 11,000 years, was now operating with proper load distribution for the first time since the founders had gone extinct. These were the facts. The record contained them. What the review session was actually about was what the facts meant. Sith submitted his counter-report on the second day. It was thorough, and it was honest in the way that reports are honest when they are also doing something else. He noted that the warden's existence had been an unknown variable, that no existing methodology could have identified it from outside the gate, and that Rail's success depended in part on information that only became available after a significant risk was taken. He noted that the translation method used was unverified by independent sources. He noted that the junction reinforcement structure was not built to any recognized engineering standard and that its long-term integrity could not be guaranteed. He was correct on every point. Everyone in the room knew it. What he did not mention was that the structure had been holding for 3 weeks without variance, and that the warden's ongoing monitoring made it more stable, not less, and that the unverified translation method had been reverse confirmed by 2 Accord scientists who had reviewed Rail's full data and found the math sound. Braith read Sith's report and said it would be included in the official record. He said this without any additional comment, which was a particular kind of reply that Sith clearly understood. Voru had submitted his own document 4 days before the session, which meant it was in the record before anyone could argue about its timing. It was not a counter-report. It was a literature summary. 32 human engineering publications from the last 40 years, each one annotated. He had found the first one, the paper on adaptive resonance patching, before the gate crisis. He had found the others while the review was being scheduled. The pattern he had identified across all 32 was specific. Humans consistently produced non-standard solutions to problems involving degraded systems, limited resources, and uncertain parameters. Not occasionally. Consistently. They had been doing it since the beginning of their spacefaring period, because their early space infrastructure was fragile, undersupplied, and far from any support network. They had built the habit of working inside broken things, because for a long time that was all they had to work with. Voru's note at the end of the document was one sentence. It said, "This is not improvisation. It is a methodology." Nobody responded to it directly during the session, but Braith read it twice. which Vora noticed because he had learned to watch Braith's eyes when Braith was thinking. Ambassador Foreign presented the human position at the end of the second day. He did not argue about the vote. He did not raise the question of provisional status. He said that the Accord's official technical reference index contained an entry on human engineering methodology that had not been updated in 14 years, and that given recent events, the entry was inaccurate. He provided corrected language. It was 2 paragraphs, professional and plain, and it described the adaptive methodology Voru had identified in exactly the kind of terms the index used for every other species. He said he would like the index updated, and he sat down. Braith looked at the proposed language for a moment. Then he entered it into the record. There was no vote because an index entry was a clerical matter, not a policy decision. Sith had nothing to object to procedurally. After the session closed, Braith walked back to the council office. Voru caught up with him in the corridor. Braith asked why Voru had submitted the literature summary before the session instead of during it, where it would have carried more weight as a rebuttal. Voru said that he had wanted it to be true before it was useful. Braith walked another few steps without responding. Then he said that Voru had done good work. He said it once, without looking at him. It was the kind of acknowledgement that, from Braith, was not small. Voru returned to his office and read through the index entry one more time after it had been officially filed. It was accurate. It was in the record. It would be there the next time someone looked up humanity in the Accord's reference system and tried to decide how seriously to take them. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, exactly what Foreign had asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. Just the record corrected. Just the truth in the right place. The quarterly session of the Galactic Accord was not the kind of event that changed things. It was the kind of event where things that had already changed were made official. Braith opened the session with the standard items. Trade route confirmations. Resource allocation reviews. A minor boundary dispute between 2 member species that had been minor for 11 years and showed every sign of remaining so. These things moved through the agenda with the steady pace of machinery that had been running for a long time and knew its own rhythm. Near the end of the session, Braith raised a procedural motion. His voice was exactly the same as it was for everything else he said in that room. He proposed reclassifying humanity's standing within the Accord from provisional to full member, with the rights and protections that designation carried. He read the motion. He asked for discussion. There was less of it than most people in the room had expected. A few delegates asked questions about the timeline and the administrative process. One asked whether the Warden's communication protocol, now formally adopted across the Accord and translated into 4 species technical standards, would continue to be maintained by human engineers. Foreign said it would, and that the protocol had been designed to be transferable, which it had been, because Rail had written the documentation himself before he left the station. The vote took 50 seconds. 8 in favor, 1 against. The 1 against was the Dravosi Collective's representative, not Sith. Sith had returned to the collective after the review session and had not been seen at the Accord since. The representative who voted against was a delegate named Torval, who had made no public statement and would not make one afterward. The vote was recorded without comment. Foreign thanked the council in the formal phrase and the correct dialect and the correct bow. He had done this many times now. It did not feel different than it usually did, and he decided that was fine. Recognition that felt like a relief was recognition that had been withheld too long. He preferred to think of this as a correction. Rail was not in the chamber. He was at the outpost near the gate. He had gone back 3 days after the review session concluded, because the Warden's interface needed documentation that only he could write accurately, and because while he was writing it he had started noticing small things in the Warden's output that he wanted to understand better. Small things had a way of being important. He had learned this early and had never unlearned it. Captain Dale sent him a message when the vote result came through. It said, "You're official." He sent back, "Tell them I'm busy." She replied with 2 words that were not appropriate to include in any official record, and then went back to her duties. Rail kept working. The documentation was nearly complete. The Warden's output had been consistent for 3 weeks, which was long enough to establish a baseline, but not long enough to know what the normal variation looked like. He was building a model of the variation. It required him to be there, checking readings, because the Warden's communication was subtle and the translation protocol was good, but not perfect, and the imperfect parts were the parts where the most information lived. On the evening of the day the vote passed, Rail was running a routine check on the junction reinforcement he had built. The structure was holding. The warden's load calculations showed exactly what they should. He was about to close the check and write up the log when his scanner caught something. The gate's resonance frequency had shifted. Not significantly. Not in any way that would have been visible on the standard Accord monitoring equipment. It was a micro-adjustment, exactly the kind of fine-tuning the warden performed constantly to keep the gate stable. Rail had seen hundreds of them, but this one was different. Not in its function, in its timing. He pulled the log and went back through it. The same micro-adjustment, the same frequency, the same fractional shift appeared in the record every 6 hours since the day the gate had stabilized. Regular as a pulse. Technically unnecessary, because the junction was stable and the resonance was within acceptable range, and the warden's own calculations would have confirmed it did not need checking. Rail sat with the log for a while. Then he understood. He understood it the way he understood things in the gate, not by having it explained, but by reading the shape of it. The warden was checking whether he was still there. Every 6 hours, it made a small and unnecessary adjustment in the one part of the gate that Rail had physically repaired, because that was the part that would tell it whether Rail was still monitoring. And every 6 hours, Rail's system had sent back a routine confirmation, the way monitoring systems do, and the warden had registered it and waited another 6 hours and checked again. Rail looked at the wall of the outpost for a moment. Outside the wall, through 200 meters of hull and insulation and vacuum, the gate was running its maintenance cycle with quiet efficiency, as it had for 11,000 years and as it would for whatever came next. He decided he would stay another week. The documentation wasn't finished anyway, and the variation model needed more data. He wrote the decision into his log with no particular explanation. Then he sent a confirmation signal to the warden's interface, the same way the system had been doing automatically every 6 hours. He sent it manually this time. The gate's resonance held steady. In the warden's log, which Rail had set up to output in readable format, the status entry updated itself without prompting. It read, active, attended. Rail closed the log file, opened the documentation, and kept working.